They told you China was losing. They told you the sanctions were working. They told you that cutting off the chips would cripple Beijing's ambitions and hand America a generational technological advantage. They were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically, historically wrong. And the evidence has been sitting in plain sight for anyone willing to look past the headlines. I spent weeks investigating what I can only describe as the most audacious technological mobilization since the Manhattan Project. Except this time, there are no photographs. There are no press releases. There are no victory speeches. Because China doesn't want you to know what they built while you were watching the sanctions announcements. And what they built should terrify every person who assumed that cutting off the supply chain was the same as winning the war. Let me take you back to October 2022. Washington unleashed what analysts called the most sweeping export controls in modern history. The target was simple: starve China of the tools it needs to build advanced semiconductors, and you starve China of the future. The logic seemed airtight. You cannot build a modern AI superpower without cutting-edge chips. You cannot build cutting-edge chips without ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. You cannot design those chips without electronic design automation software. And you cannot run frontier AI models without Nvidia's highest performance processors. America controlled all 4 choke points simultaneously. The stock market celebrated. Chinese tech firms lost billions in market value overnight. Commentators declared the race effectively over. China was locked out of the future. The sanctions were working. The strategy was genius. Go home, everybody, America won. Except nobody told China. Because while Wall Street was pricing in a Chinese technological collapse, something extraordinary was happening inside server rooms, mountain tunnels, desert plains, and ocean floors across the largest country on Earth. China was not retreating. China was not begging. China was not negotiating. China was adapting. And the adaptation was so elegant, so structurally sound, so deeply funded by state power that it didn't just survive the sanctions. It rendered them almost irrelevant. And I mean that literally. Not as hyperbole, not as clickbait. I mean that the specific mechanisms America used to contain China have been systematically neutralized one by one, in ways that Western analysts are only now beginning to understand, and in ways that the mainstream financial media has almost completely failed to report. Here is what I found. And I want you to understand that every single piece of this is documented, verifiable, and largely ignored in Western media. Not because it is secret, because nobody was looking in the right places. Because the story was happening in languages most Western analysts don't read, in regions most Western journalists never visit, in technical disciplines most financial commentators don't understand. This is the information asymmetry of the century. And today I am going to close that gap completely. To understand what China built, you have to first understand exactly what America took away. Because the precision of the attack matters. This was not a broad embargo. This was a surgical strike on 3 specific choke points that America believed were irreplaceable. The first choke point was the brain. Electronic design automation software is the software that engineers use to design semiconductors. You cannot draw a modern chip on paper. The circuits are so small, so complex, so layered, that only specialized software can model them, simulate them, and prepare them for manufacturing. The dominant EDA tools in the world are American: Synopsys, Cadence, Mentor Graphics. Without access to these tools, the conventional wisdom said China could not design advanced chips at all. It would be like trying to build a skyscraper without architectural software. You might understand the principles, but you cannot execute the complexity. The second choke point was the factory. ASML is a Dutch company, but it operates under American influence and American export license requirements for its most advanced machines. Its extreme ultraviolet lithography systems are the only machines on Earth capable of printing the most advanced chip geometries. There is no alternative. No other company makes them. No other technology replicates them. There's exactly one supply chain for these machines in the entire world, and America put a lock on it. Without EUV machines, China could not manufacture chips at the leading edge. They could design all day long, but they could not build what they designed. The third choke point was the fuel. Nvidia's H100 and A100 chips are not just products. They are the electricity of the AI age. Training a frontier artificial intelligence model without them is like trying to run a steel mill on a bicycle generator. The compute requirements are so enormous that without access to these specific processors, the assumption was that China could not compete at the frontier of AI development. Not this decade. Maybe not ever. The performance gap between Nvidia's restricted chips and anything China could access domestically was measured not in percentage points, but in orders of magnitude. 3 choke points: brain, factory, fuel. All controlled. All locked. The cage was perfect. And then China walked out of it. The first thing China did was attack the problem at the architectural level. And this is the move that I believe will be studied in business schools and military academies for the next 50 years. When you cannot get the most powerful chips, you change what your software asks of the chips. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is one of the most profound reorientations of engineering philosophy in the history of computing. And it produced DeepSeek. When Western AI companies had spent years in a brute force arms race, the philosophy was scale. More parameters, more compute, more Nvidia hardware, more electricity, more money, more performance. OpenAI trained GPT-4 on an almost incomprehensible amount of compute. The assumption baked into every Western AI strategy was that scale was not just a path to intelligence, it was the only path. If you cannot scale, you cannot compete. If you cannot compete, you lose. And since China could not access the hardware needed to scale, China would lose. That was the entire theory of the sanctions. DeepSeek destroyed that theory in a single research paper. Using an architecture called mixture of experts, Chinese engineers built a model that performs at the frontier level while consuming a fraction of the computational resources that Western models require. The mechanism is elegant to the point of being almost philosophical. Instead of activating every parameter in the neural network every time you process a query, the mixture of experts architecture routes each query to only the relevant subset of the network. The experts that are not needed for a given task simply do not activate. They consume no power, they demand no compute. They sit dormant while the relevant experts do the work. Think about what this means in practical terms. A Western AI model running on thousands of Nvidia H100s is like a city where every light in every building turns on every time someone asks for directions. DeepSeek is a city where only the relevant streetlights activate. The computational efficiency is not a modest improvement. It is a fundamental re-architecting of the relationship between intelligence and energy, and it came directly from the pressure of sanctions. Necessity did not just mother invention here. Necessity mothered a revolution. But I want to be precise about something because this point gets misunderstood constantly in the Western coverage. DeepSeek's efficiency is not just a workaround. It is not a clever hack that produces inferior results at lower cost. Independent benchmarks show DeepSeek performing competitively with the most advanced Western models across a broad range of tasks. This is not China building a cheaper, worse version of American AI. This is China building a different kind of AI that achieves comparable results through a fundamentally different philosophy. The implications for the sanctions strategy are devastating because the sanctions were designed to create a performance gap. And the performance gap is closing. Not because China smuggled chips, not because China hacked Western research, because Chinese engineers sat down with inferior hardware and figured out how to make it do more. You cannot embargo that. You cannot sanction mathematical insight. And that is the first wall of the cage that crumbled. Now let us talk about the hardware problem itself, because China did not just solve the software side of the equation. They attacked the hardware constraints with equal ferocity and equal ingenuity. And the strategy they deployed was actually two strategies running simultaneously. The first was compression. Advanced AI at scale requires chips to communicate with each other at extraordinary speeds. The technical infrastructure that enables this communication is called high bandwidth interconnects. Think of it as the nervous system of a distributed computing cluster. The faster and more efficiently the chips can share information with each other, the more effectively they function as a unified system. America restricted China's access to the most advanced versions of these interconnect technologies. The theory was that even if China had chips, they could not network them effectively enough to run frontier workloads. Chinese engineers responded by developing compression techniques that allow more information to travel through the same bandwidth, not by increasing the pipe, by making the water thinner. The data flowing between chips was optimized, compressed, and restructured in ways that extracted more effective throughput from the existing infrastructure. It is the engineering equivalent of discovering that you can fit twice as many passengers on a train by redesigning the seats rather than building a longer train. The physical constraint did not change. The approach to working within it changed everything. The second hardware strategy was distribution. If you cannot have 10 of the world's best chips, you use 10,000 of the second best chips. Distributed computing at this scale is not a new idea. But executing it at the level China has executed it requires three things that very few nations possess simultaneously: massive quantities of mid-tier hardware, extraordinary software engineering to coordinate that hardware efficiently, and cheap, abundant, reliable energy to power it all. China had all three. And that brings us to the part of this investigation that genuinely shocked me. The part that I believe is the most underreported story in global technology today: the energy strategy. While the world was focused on chips, China was building something that makes the chip question almost secondary. They were building energy sovereignty at a scale that no other nation has attempted in the modern era. And they were doing it specifically, deliberately, and strategically in service of their technological ambitions. The program is called East Data West Computing. The concept begins with geography. China's eastern coastal cities, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, Hangzhou, are the engines of the digital economy. They generate data at an almost incomprehensible rate. Financial transactions, social media, e-commerce, industrial sensors, autonomous vehicle telemetry. The data is created in the East, but the East is also the most expensive, most densely populated, most energy-constrained part of China. Running massive data centers in Shanghai costs a fortune. China's western regions are the opposite: vast, sparsely populated, geologically stable, and blessed with some of the most abundant renewable energy resources on the planet. The Gobi Desert receives solar irradiance that rivals the Sahara. The Tibetan Plateau and the mountain ranges of Xinjiang and Sichuan generate wind and hydroelectric power in quantities that strain comprehension. The strategy was to build the computing infrastructure where the energy is, and build the network infrastructure to connect it to where the data is generated. But East Data-West computing is just the frame. What China built inside that frame is where the story becomes extraordinary. They built data centers inside mountains. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not data centers near mountains, not data centers with mountain views. Data centers carved into the rock itself, using the thermal mass of the Earth as a passive cooling system. Conventional data centers are thermal management problems as much as they are computing problems. The chips generate enormous heat. Managing that heat consumes enormous energy. Air conditioning systems, cooling towers, liquid cooling infrastructure, all of it adds cost, complexity, and energy consumption to every calculation the chips perform. China looked at this problem and found a solution that has been available for geological epochs. Rock is cold. Deep rock is very cold, and rock does not require electricity to stay cold. The facilities built inside mountains in provinces like Guizhou and Sichuan use the natural temperature of the surrounding geology to cool the servers passively. The energy savings are not marginal. In a conventional data center, cooling can account for 30 to 40% of total energy consumption. Eliminate cooling costs, and you have just made every chip in the facility 30 to 40% more economically efficient. At the scale China is operating, that efficiency advantage compounds into a strategic moat that is almost impossible for conventionally built Western data centers to compete with. And then there is the Gobi Desert. The solar installations being built in China's northwestern deserts are not power plants in any conventional sense. They are the foundations of a new energy civilization, projected to generate hundreds of gigawatts of renewable electricity. These installations represent a bet on a specific future. A future where the cost of computation is determined primarily by the cost of electricity. A future where the nation with the cheapest electricity wins the AI race, not the nation with the best chips, not the nation with the most venture capital, not the nation with the most PhDs. The nation with the most electrons, generated most cheaply from sources that cannot be sanctioned. Think about what this means strategically. Nvidia can be export controlled. ASML machines can be embargoed. EDA software licenses can be revoked, but photons hitting silicon panels in the Gobi Desert cannot be sanctioned. The energy flowing from those panels into the data centers built into those mountains cannot be embargoed. The computation performed by chips cooled by geological rock cannot be export controlled. China has built a technology infrastructure with an energy foundation that is completely immune to the primary weapon in America, its strategic arsenal. And it gets deeper than solar panels in the desert. China has been experimenting with underwater data centers in a program that sounds like science fiction until you examine the engineering logic and realize it is simply physics applied with extraordinary ambition. The concept is straightforward. Ocean water at depth is cold. Cold water absorbs heat efficiently. If you seal server hardware in waterproof containers and submerge them in the ocean itself becomes the cooling system. No cooling towers, no refrigeration units, no air conditioning infrastructure, no energy expenditure fighting thermodynamics. Just the passive thermal mass of the ocean, absorbing heat from the servers the same way it has been absorbing heat from the Earth's mantle for 4 billion years. Microsoft experimented with this concept in a project called Natick off the coast of Scotland. They proved the concept worked, then largely moved on. China took the concept and began scaling it. Sealed server pods being tested in Chinese coastal waters represent a computing infrastructure that is cheaper to cool than anything built on land, in locations that are difficult to surveil, difficult to target, and completely independent of terrestrial power grid vulnerabilities. When you combine underwater computing nodes with mountain data centers, powered by Gobi Desert solar farms connected by a national fiber backbone to the eastern coastal cities generating the data, you begin to understand that China has not just built a computing infrastructure. China has built a computing civilization, distributed, resilient, sovereign, largely immune to the disruptions that a conventional adversary might attempt to impose. Now I have to talk about the money, because none of this happened organically. None of this emerged from the invisible hand of the free market responding to price signals. This was a sovereign decision, executed with sovereign resources, over a timeline that no publicly traded company operating under quarterly earnings pressure could have sustained. The government's role in this story cannot be overstated and cannot be separated from the outcome. When American export controls hit Chinese technology firms in October 2022, the market response was immediate and brutal. Stocks crashed. Billions in market capitalization evaporated. In a purely market-driven economy, that signal would have triggered capital flight, reduced investment, and a gradual retreat from the most capital-intensive areas of competition. That is not what happened. What happened instead is that the Chinese government looked at the market signal and overrode it with a strategic signal. The message from Beijing was not spoken loudly. It did not need to be. It was transmitted through the mechanisms that the Chinese state uses to communicate strategic priority. Subsidized electricity rates for facilities running on domestically produced chips. Not a small discount. A structural cost advantage that changed the economic calculus for every company making a build or buy decision about computing infrastructure. If you use Chinese chips in your Chinese data center, your electricity costs less. The incentive is not subtle. It is a direct government subsidy for technological sovereignty, disguised as an energy pricing policy. Huawei received billions in direct government grants. Not loans, not tax credits. Grants. Free money from the state to accelerate research, development, and supply chain independence in semiconductor design and manufacturing. Huawei's Kirin chips, which had been effectively killed by the original Huawei sanctions of 2019, came back. Not at the bleeding edge of global performance, but competitive enough to power smartphones, competitive enough to run data center workloads, competitive enough to reduce China's dependence on foreign silicon in ways that matter strategically. The grants made this possible on a timeline that market forces alone could never have achieved. Other firms received similar treatment. State-owned banks extended credit on terms that no private lender would offer. Government procurement policies mandated the use of domestic technology in sensitive applications, creating guaranteed demand that gave Chinese chip designers the revenue they needed to fund the next generation of development. The entire apparatus of the Chinese state was oriented toward a single objective: build the capability, secure the supply chain, achieve independence. The cost was acceptable because the alternative, permanent technological dependence on an adversary that had already demonstrated its willingness to use that dependence as a weapon, was deemed existentially unacceptable. This is the decision that Western strategists consistently underestimate when they model the impact of sanctions on China. They model China as a market economy that will respond to price signals the way a market economy responds to price signals. China is not a market economy in the relevant sense. It is a state-directed economy with market characteristics. The state sets the strategic objective. The market is the tool used to achieve it. When the market points in the wrong direction, the state corrects the market. The cost of that correction is charged to the national balance sheet and treated as an investment in national survival. You cannot model that with a standard economic framework. And every sanction strategy that has failed to account for it has failed. Now let us zoom out. Because the chip story and the energy story and the infrastructure story are all chapters in a larger story. The larger story is about what happens to the global balance of power when a civilization of 1.4 billion people decides that technological sovereignty is not a luxury but a survival requirement, and begins to execute against that decision with the full resources of the state over a multi-decade time horizon. The sectors that are transforming are not limited to AI and semiconductors. They are the sectors that will define the 21st century economy in its entirety. Electric vehicles. China now manufactures more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. Not slightly more, dramatically more. BYD has surpassed Tesla in global EV sales. The supply chains for batteries, motors, power electronics, and charging infrastructure are dominated by Chinese firms operating at scales that Western competitors are only beginning to understand they need to match. The semiconductor sanctions were partly motivated by concerns about the military applications of advanced chips. But the EV dominance is not military, it is commercial. It is the future of personal transportation, and it is Chinese. Battery technology. The silver carbon anode that Samsung is developing in South Korea is one piece of a much larger battery technology race. CATL, the Chinese battery manufacturer, controls a larger share of the global battery market than all Western battery manufacturers combined. The knowledge, the patents, the manufacturing experience, the supply chain relationships, the economies of scale, all of it sits predominantly in China. And the Chinese government's investment in battery technology predates the recent Western awakening by more than a decade. They were not reacting to a trend, they were creating one. Renewable energy supply chains, solar panels, wind turbines, the physical hardware of the energy transition. China manufactures the overwhelming majority of it, the polysilicon that goes into solar panels, the rare earth elements that go into wind turbine generators, the lithium processing that goes into battery cells. The Chinese government identified these supply chains as strategic assets 15 years ago and systematically built dominance in all of them. Today, a Western country that wants to build out renewable energy infrastructure is, in most cases, dependent on Chinese manufactured components to do it. The irony is almost too perfect. The technology that Western nations are deploying to achieve energy independence from fossil fuels runs predominantly on Chinese hardware. They have traded one dependency for another. This is not accidental. It is the result of a coherent, long-term strategy that prioritizes supply chain control over short-term profit, technology leadership over financial returns, and national resilience over market efficiency. It is a strategy that the Western world, optimized for quarterly earnings and electoral cycles, finds genuinely difficult to understand and even more difficult to replicate. The broader lesson of what I found during this investigation is one of the most important strategic lessons of the modern era, and it applies far beyond China, far beyond technology, far beyond geopolitics. Sanctions can wound, but sanctions applied to a determined, centrally coordinated, resource-rich civilization with a generational time horizon do not destroy. They forge. The historical evidence for this is overwhelming. Japan in the 1930s faced Western pressure over resources and accelerated its industrial and military mobilization. The Soviet Union built its nuclear program under total Western opposition and achieved parity within a decade of Hiroshima. Iran developed a domestic aerospace, missile, and nuclear fuel cycle capability under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. In every case, the sanctions created the very motivation they were designed to prevent. They transformed a strategic ambition into an existential imperative. And existential imperatives are the most powerful forces in human affairs. China is the largest, wealthiest, most technically capable nation to ever face a comprehensive technology sanctions regime. The result was predictable to anyone who understood the historical pattern. And yet the strategy proceeded as if the history did not exist, as if China were a smaller, weaker, less determined version of an adversary that would simply capitulate when the supply chain was cut. The data centers inside mountains tell a different story. The solar farms in the Gobi Desert tell a different story. The server pods under the ocean tell a different story. The mixture of experts' architectures that made DeepSeek possible tell a different story. The billions in government grants to Huawei and SMIC and every other firm in the critical supply chain tell a different story. The story they tell is that you cannot sanction a civilization into submission. You can only sanction it into self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency, achieved under pressure, with the full weight of state resources behind it, over a multi-decade timeline, with the goal of never being vulnerable again, produces something that the sanctions were specifically designed to prevent. It produces independence. It produces resilience. It produces a competitor that is harder to contain after the sanctions than before them. The question I am left with, after weeks of investigating this story, is not whether the sanctions failed. The evidence is clear that they failed to achieve their primary objective of maintaining a decisive technological gap between American and Chinese AI capabilities. The question is what comes next. Because we are now in a world where two technological civilizations are developing increasingly divergent and increasingly incompatible infrastructure stacks. American cloud, Chinese cloud, American chips, Chinese chips, American AI models, Chinese AI models, American energy grid, Chinese energy grid. The decoupling that started as a policy choice is hardening into a structural reality. And structural realities are very difficult to reverse. The nations and companies and individuals who understand this reality early will position themselves accordingly. The ones who are still operating on the assumption that China is a junior partner in a Western-led technological order are going to face a very rude awakening. Because inside those mountains in Guizhou, under the ocean, off the Chinese coast, beneath the solar panels in the Gobi Desert, behind the research papers that most Western analysts did not read until it was too late, a new technological civilization has been building itself, quietly, systematically, with extraordinary patience and extraordinary resources and an absolutely unambiguous strategic intention. They told you China was losing. I investigated. What I found was that the race is not over. In several critical dimensions, it may already be won. And the most important question now is not how to stop China from catching up. The most important question is whether the Western world has finally understood what it is actually competing against. The Manhattan Project comparison is not hyperbole. It is the most precise analogy available. Except this Manhattan Project does not end with a single weapon. It ends with an entire civilization that has achieved technological sovereignty in the industries that will define the next century. Energy, computation, transportation, storage, communication, all of it, built in secret, built under pressure, built to last, built to win. That is what I found. And I have not been able to stop thinking about it since